Hi. So this is not exactly a frequently asked question, but during the Q&A after a meetup talk, I got this very interesting question around how do we deal with differences in culture when we're talking about team interactions. So if you're familiar with the book, Team Topologies, you know that we talk about three core interaction modes: collaboration, facilitating, and X as a service, which hopefully are clarifying and helping teams be much more intentional in when they're engaging with other teams. So having a clear purpose, duration for the interaction is very important. And so how does culture, and especially kind of at the country level, different countries have different cultures, how does that influence this the efficiency of these interactions? In my opinion, the first aspect is to acknowledge that there are these cultural differences, especially as organizations become more and more distributed around the world. So acknowledge that, and then when we're engaging, especially for the first time with certain teams in different cultures, making sure we have the time to talk it out and understand how we're going to deal with this. So it's good to have references for what are the differences in culture, so it doesn't feel like it's something kind of personal between the teams. We all belong to a culture based on where we were born, where we grew up, and so having some references that we can use can be quite helpful. And so I have this book which I find very interesting. It's called Cultures and Organizations: Software of the Mind. And at least for someone who's starting in terms of trying to understand better differences in culture, it can be very helpful. It actually allows ranks countries along different dimensions, such as things like power distance, how individualistic is this culture, and also, for example, what is the tolerance to uncertainty in this culture? So those things can vary greatly between different countries. And so, for example, if we're trying to have two teams where one is facilitating knowledge to another team, so in a kind of teaching role or mentoring role, if, let's say, the team that is receiving the knowledge is part of their culture is very hierarchical, that they're not used to kind of talk and question whatever people in a higher position tell them. And so you might get into a situation where we're trying to help them learn some knowledge in some domain, and they're not actually feeling free. The other team is not feeling free to let us know when they're actually not understanding what we're trying to say. And so how do we deal with that? In that situation, perhaps making clear that everyone's welcome to ask questions, that there are no dumb questions, and furthermore, explicitly asking people to summarize the key ideas so that we can then have that as a way to understand if some of the concepts and some of the things we're trying to get through are not exactly well explained. So we need to do a better job. So that's just one example where if we understand there are differences in culture along these different dimensions, that can help us set up our interactions in a more meaningful, more efficient way. So again, I think as a starting point, this book, there's actually an online kind of comparison tool based on the book where you can just select different countries and see how they are ranked along these different dimensions. So that can be quite useful. So it's essentially that, acknowledging, especially if you have teams across different parts of the world, that they belong to different cultures in terms of especially in terms of the country where those people live and those teams live. And we acknowledge, and then we make time to address and talk about how we're going to address that. And then during the interactions, both teams should keep in mind what are those cultural differences, so we can find ways to improve the interactions and make sure they are meaningful. So I hope that's useful. And it, again, I think was a very interesting question that we don't always are thinking, especially in organizations that are distributed around the world.